Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for this brand new video. When it comes to an EF core referential actions, we all think that hey, we got this, we know how they work. Until we get to, well, maybe add a new migration to a project and we want to update the database and we get this error and we get very frustrated. And this error says that hey, you have some problem with one of the constraints that you are trying to set, and this may cause cycles of multiple cascade paths. Now, what does this even mean? In this video, I will provide you the clearest explanation that you'll find anywhere online regarding what referential actions are, how or what actually those cycles of cascade paths are, and of course we'll look into different strategies on how to fix this issue and to fix it in a very informed way so that we know exactly what to expect. So stay tuned because we will dive right into it. Let's start by actually looking into the entities that we have for this current setup and project. And I will start for the entity that I will consider to be, let's say, at the top, and you will see exactly why. And this is the user profile. Now, the user profile, it has an I collection of blogs, it has an I collection of posts, and it has an I collection of comments. Now, if we go in those classes, we see that, hey, this is the blog, and the blog has, of course, a required relationship to our user. And we know that it's a required relationship because this foreign key here is not nullable. So it's not nullable of int, but it's just a regular int. Now, if we go down the line here, we see that we have this post. And this post has a required relationship to our blog because a post belongs to a blog. And then it has a required relationship to a user because each blog post has actually an author or a user profile that has written it. And if we go further down the line, we have this comment that has a required relationship on post because each comment should belong to a post, and it has a required relationship to a user because each comment, once again, it has an author, it has a user that has created it. And that's why what we have here is a very standard one-to-many relationships between user and blog, user and post, user and comments. We have then one-to-many relationship, and once again, required relationship between blog and posts. And we have, once again, a required relationship between post and comments. Like one post can have several other comments. And that's kind of like the data model that we have right here. And we know already from the intro the error that we receive when we try to update the database. Now, this means that we already have a migration here. So let's start by looking into this migration and trying to understand what the problem might be. Now, this file here is with red because it is not added yet to the source control, because during this video we'll kind of remove it and we'll add probably a new one. But the idea is that if we take a look into what we get here or what type of setup actually EF Core tries to do here is we have these create table users, which is of course our, I would say, let's say, topmost entity, because all the other entities in one way or the other are related to that user. And it has these three columns, like user profile ID, which is the primary key, and then the first name and last name. So everything is clear, straightforward, no big deal here. Now, things begin to be a little bit more interesting when we look into these create table blogs, because here we want to create a table blogs. Now, and this one, of course, it has the blog ID, which is a primary key, but it also has a user profile ID, which is a foreign key to the user profile that was just created. And we see that it's nullable false, so it's not nullable. It needs to have a value. Now, this also means that we have some constraints here. Of course, we have the primary key constraint, but then we have this foreign key constraint. And here I want to go a little bit into explaining what actually these referential actions actually mean, because I understand, or I have seen, that there is a little bit of misunderstanding around them. The first thing that pops into mind when we think about what actually these referential actions are is, okay, we have this referential action cascade, and we kind of like understand conceptually that this means that when we delete basically an entity, a parent entity, then also the child entity or the dependent entity will also be deleted. This is kind of like what this cascade means. Now, of course, we can have also other values, and we'll look into that a little bit later in this video. Now, the idea is that, or the first question that comes here to mind is, okay, but how do we know exactly who's the parent and who's the child? Because it's a little bit misleading that you see here these referential actions actually on this blogs table, when actually the parent entity is the user profile. And we know this by interpreting actually what we see here, because it says that, hey, this is a foreign key, and the principal table, so the table to which it points is the users table, and the principal column is the user profile ID in the user table, of course. And the idea is that always the entity that contains the foreign key is actually the dependent entity. So what this referential action cascade means is that when I delete a user profile, the blog or the blogs of that user profile will also be deleted. Not that if I delete, for instance, this blog or a blog, that also the user will be deleted. And some might be inclined to actually think that, but no, it's when a user will be deleted, it cascades down to the dependent entity, which in this case it's the blog, because the blog is the entity that contains actually the foreign key. So that's actually how this referential actions with cascade works. And by default, Entity Framework Core, when it generates the migration, it adds this on delete with cascade, because since this is a required relationship, so you cannot have a blog without a user or a user profile in this case, it means that when a user is deleted, we don't want to have this orphaned blog in our database, so we also want to delete it as well. Now, if we go one step further, we see this post. Now, this posts table is in a way similar to what we have in a blogs, only, or with the only difference that we actually have, here two required relationships. So we have a required relationship that points to the blog through the blog ID. So this is the principal entity, blog is the principal entity, post is the dependent entity. So it means that when we delete a blog, also the post for that blog will be deleted. But then this post also has a required relationship to the user profile through this users table with the user profile ID as a foreign key. And the referential action is also cascade. So it means once again that in this relationship between the user profile and the post, the user profile is the parent entity, and then this post is the dependent entity. So when a user profile gets deleted, also the posts that the user created should be deleted. And then last but not least, we create the table, and that's really similar to the post. And here we have once again this required relationship between a comment and the post. So it means that when a post will be deleted, also the comments that belong to that post will be deleted. This is what this referential action actually means. And then we have exactly the same thing, but towards the user profile. And once again, when user profile gets deleted, then it should cascade also to the comments. So all the comments that were created by that user profile or by that user should also be deleted. So this is actually what this referential action means. But what's the whole point with the cycle of cascade paths that we actually see in that error? And to do that, I will head over to a whiteboard and try to explain it very, very graphically what actually those cycles are. And I can assure you that after this explanation, you will have a full understanding of what these cycle paths are, or cycle cascade paths are, and how can you avoid them. So here we are at this whiteboard, or actually that's a blackboard, and we try to understand what those cycles of multiple cascade paths actually are. And we will try to explain this in a very graphical way and based on what we have discussed earlier regarding those referential actions. And let's start from the user profile. And if we think about the referential actions that we had in that migration, what it would mean is that when we kind of like delete a user profile, it has a required, or all the other entities have a required relationship to the user profile. And we have this referential action set to cascade. So this means that if I want to delete a user profile, the user profile will also delete the blog, and then the user profile will also delete the posts that were created by the user. Let me just do it like this. And then, of course, it would mean that when we delete the user profile, also the comments that the user made will also be deleted. So this is what happens actually. But then there's more to that, because we have also here a required relationship between blog and post. So when a blog is deleted, then also the posts that should correspond to that blog need to be deleted. And that's why when kind of like this execution arrives here at the blog, so the user profile wants to delete the blog, but then the blog also wants to delete the posts that kind of like belong to the blog. And as you can see basically here, we have two cycles because the user profile will try to delete the posts, but also the blog will try to delete the posts. And if we switch to another color, that's kind of like very, very similar between post and comments. Like when a post gets deleted, then the post also wants to delete the comments because we have a referential actions. And once again, here you can see that we have another cycle, or this is what cycles and cascade paths mean. Because as you can see, when we delete user profile, what it will happen is that at a certain point during this deletion process, we will have two different processes that will try to kind of like delete the post, and we will have two different cycles that will try to delete the comments. And that's what is actually not supported in Microsoft SQL Server, and that's why we actually get that error. So now we have looked into what actually the referential actions are, or how do they behave. Then we have tried to understand, okay, what are those cycles of multiple cascade paths? But now let's go one step further and take a look into how we can fix this problem. To do this, here we are back in Rider and we are currently in our DB context. And I have already prepared a code snippet that I will simply insert here, and we will kind of like see exactly what it does and try to explain it. Now, the idea is that when we want to fix that problem with the referential actions and actually with the cascade paths or multiple cycles of cascade paths that we have just looked into, we could at least try to manually update the migration and then specify a different referential actions. And by the way, this is a point where actually, as you will see, that the error message, the exception that you receive, is very, very misleading, because the exception says you should set the referential action to no action. But we'll see just in a few minutes that this actually doesn't really help, and we'll see exactly why. But first of all, let's try to see how we can fix it. So remember, we want to actually try to set everything up in a way that when we delete all the user profiles, or when we delete the user profiles, then all the blogs get deleted, then all the posts get deleted, and then all comments get deleted. And we want to still be able to update the database, so we shouldn't receive that error anymore. And also, of course, we should also think about that when we delete only a blog, then also the posts should be deleted and also the comments for that blog. So we go as a first step with this strategy that we still want to keep the entire data setup the way that we already have. So like when we delete something like user, everything should be deleted. We'll look at the end of this video that this strategy might be good, but in real applications, usually you would have some different other type of scenarios, and we'll discuss them briefly. But in order to kind of like solve our problem, what we have done here is we said we want to keep actually the referential actions for the user. And in fact, we can look actually here once again. So we can keep this one, the red arrows. So when we delete a user profile, we want to delete everything. And this means that we need to tweak a little bit the referential actions for these other required relationships that we have between blog and post, and between post and comment. And that's exactly what we do here. If we look into this line, we see that, for instance, okay, we have this post. So entity post, we say here, this is how we define actually a one-to-many relationship using the Fluent API of Entity Framework Core. So we say that has one blog with many posts. And then we specify here this on delete no action, because that's what the exception says. We should use no action and we should be good to go. And then we go to do exactly the same thing for the comment. We kind of like explicitly define the one-to-many relationship between post and comment using this has one post with many comments. And once again, as the error provided us the information, we set the referential actions, or this on delete, on no action. Now, the only other thing that we do here is that we also seed the database with some data, and we have this seeder class that kind of like exposes some methods that just return us some data, like some users, some blogs, some posts, and some comments. Nothing very, very complicated. So now we have updated kind of like our DB context. We have overwritten or we have manually configured the relationships, and even if they are still required, we have specified a different referential action here, which is no action, which in terms means, or it should mean, that if you delete the parent entity, do nothing with the child entity. So this is what it actually should mean. Now we can go here, for instance, and we can go with this add migration initial. So let's add a new migration. And this time, migration should look actually exactly the same that it looked before, with the only difference that we should have some insert statement that will actually, look into or insert some data into our database. So if we look into the migration, let's make this a little bit smaller. We'll see that once again, we create a table users, we create a table blogs, we create a table posts with all the constraints that we even had previously. And then we see that we create this comment, and on this comment we are also okay. And you see here we keep the cascade for the user, but we don't specify anything like no action for the other required relationship. So this is the only thing that's changed. And of course we have this insert. We have a lot we have some inserts because we want to insert some data. And let's run the database update right now and take a look, because right now, since we have reconfigured this, I would say that the database needs to be updated correctly. This would mean, of course, that we shouldn't get any error right now, so everything should be fine from this point of view. And see, applied migration initial and done. So basically, it means that everything was successful and we have the data in the database, which is actually very, very nice. So we managed to fix that error and we are happy that everything works until we actually want to go there and do something. And let me uncomment this type of code or this block of code that we have here. And what we do here is simply we just create a new instance of this appdb context. And what I would like to do is first, let me maybe delete this out from here. What I want to do is get a blog, whatever I get, the first blog that I get here, and then I say I want to remove the blog, and then I click save changes, or then I would assume that save changes is actually executed, and if it is successful, of course I will have this console write line and will print deleted in the console. If not, then probably we'll have an exception. So let's run this application and try to evaluate what actually the result is for that. So first of all, it will build, then it will try to kind of like, execute all the things that I have prepared here. And guess what? We have here an exception. And if we look at the exception, we have here an error occurred while saving the entity changes. See inner exception for more details. Now, the inner exception says that the delete statement conflicted with the reference constraint foreign key. The conflict occurred on the database blogging table posts and column blog ID. So what this actually means is that, okay, I tried to delete a blog, but I couldn't actually delete the related posts because I had this referential action, no action. So the database wouldn't allow me, because Microsoft SQL wouldn't allow you to delete the blog and kind of like place all the other post entities or post records on a state that is clearly not valid, since this relationship is required, or we have defined it as required, because it's not, the foreign key is non-nullable. So it means that we have a problem. Now we have solved the fact that we can now update the database, but just using what the exception provided us, like just use no action instead of cascade, didn't really help, because when we wanted to do something, well, we got here an error and we got an exception and we are back to square one. And here comes a caveat that it's very, very important to note. When you have this type of required relationships, the problem is that if you want to keep kind of like all this cascading stuff that you have, and also make sure that you can update the database, there's actually two things that you need to do. Now, the first thing that you need to do is, let's go back to DB context, and instead of setting here the referential actions to no action, or the delete behavior to no action, we set it to client cascade. What this means is that kind of like we defer the cascading of the deletion to the client, like to the SQL server or to the data store generally. But in this case, it's the SQL server. So this delete behavior is not enforced in or by entity framework anymore, but it is then deferred to the SQL server to kind of like be performed. And exactly the same thing we need to do here, like client cascade. Now, if we would run the application, of course, we need to create a new migration and update the database, and that's what we'll also do. But the idea is that, in fact, let's do this first, and then until everything is created, we will kind of like explain what happens. So first of all, add migration, and we'll call this client cascade. So first of all, we just add this migration. That shouldn't really take very long because it just adds something to this one. And then we should be able to kind of like update the database, and we should be good to go. .NET EF database update. Cool. Now, the idea is that right now, basically what will happen is that if we run the program, we will have the exact same error as before. And here is the caveat that I was talking about. Because if you have this type of setup, when you have required relationships and you have deferred the cascading to the SQL server, there is one important thing that you need to note with Entity Framework Core. And this is that all the entities that should be affected by the delete behavior should actually be also tracked by the context. So that's why, for instance, I say here this var user, and I get the user, and I include the blogs, the posts, the comments of that user, and then I get the blog that I want to delete. And now if I run the application, everything should be actually good right now. So if we just wait a little bit, everything should be executed, and then we would see this deleted. So deleted, it means that right now it was executed correctly. So once again, if you have kind of like this type of setup, when you have required relationships, and you want to kind of like get rid of the error or of the exception that you get when you try to update the database, but also make sure that the behavior or the application will still work correctly, then these are two things that you have to take into consideration. First of all, you should take, or if you go to the DB context, we should set the delete behavior to client cascade, not no action. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, of course, that all the entities that needs to be deleted by that cascade needs to be tracked or need to be tracked by the context. Otherwise, it simply will not work and it will fail. So this was kind of like the first strategy that we had, or that we could use to approach this type of scenario where we have this problem with referential actions and delete behavior, and how we can actually implement or get around it and implement it properly so that it continues to work. However, there is also another strategy that we can even employ. And let's just think for 1 second. Now, what we wanted from the get-go is that when we delete a user profile, we want to delete the blogs, we want to delete the post, we want to delete the comments. And also, if we delete a blog, we want to delete the post, and we want to delete the comments. And we would say, hey, that's how things should be. However, in reality, you will say that in most cases, in a lot of the applications, based on the customer requirements, actually data is not deleted from the database that often. There are different approaches that we can actually have, because the main reason is that data is mostly used by companies also for different type of, let's say, maybe statistical or historical reasons. So one thing that happens a lot or in different projects, and once again, this kind of like depends on also what the requirements of the customer are, or what the requirements of the product owners are. And it could be like, for instance, I had worked on cases where they said, no, we just want to keep the data in the database. Of course, then in that case, we should allow the foreign keys to be null. Because they wanted to keep the data for historical, once again, and statistical perspective. Now, over that, they might, apply some obfuscation of PII information according to GDPR policies and so on and so forth. But usually, or in a lot of scenarios, is that kind of like the deletion of the data is not required from the database. And also in a lot of applications, you have this concept of soft delete. So when you're deleting a user, it's actually not deleted really from the database, but mostly it's just maybe a flag set that is deleted equals true. And maybe after 30 days, it will be deleted, or maybe after 1 year. That kind of like, once again, depends on the requirements of each application. There might be also let's say the other case that when we delete some data, we still don't want to actually delete it for good from our company, but in a database like that we use for an application, this is the data that kind of like we use for that application. But for historical purposes or statistical purposes, we might want to move the data maybe to a data lake or to a data warehouse where we could apply, I don't know, Power BI queries or a lot of different things. So this is another scenario that happens very often. You don't really need to delete the data, but probably you would have some background processes that will take from time to time the orphaned data and will move it to some other data storage. Now, the idea is that this is also an option. And in all these scenarios that I have once again encountered in real applications, because those were the requirements of the customers or of the product owners, is that actually the data shouldn't really be deleted. And in that case, to solve all the problems, it's even easier than that. Because the only thing you would have to do is make those relationships not required. And the way that you actually do this is simply go here to the blog, and where we have this property that kind of like refers to the foreign key of the user profile, we just set it as nullable. If we go to the comment, now here we have this post ID, we set this to nullable, and then we have this integer for user profile ID, and we also make this nullable. Now, then for post, exactly the same thing. The blog ID, we set it to be nullable, and for user profile ID, once again, we set it to be nullable. And to make sure everything works, I also have reset the database to an initial state. I have deleted all the migrations, I have deleted all the tables, and I have tweaked a little bit here this on model creating method, because what we want is still to be seeding data, because we want to kind of like perform a deletion and show exactly what the outcome of the deletion will be now that we have optional relationships, so that are not required anymore. So to continue this, let's add a new migration, or let's actually add the initial migration, because everything has been deleted. So we are starting with a clean slate from scratch, let's say. So we build here and the migration is added, and we'll just take also a look at the migration file to understand exactly what happened with that. But I guess before we do this, we can also run this database update. And in the meantime, while the database updates, we can then take a look at the migration itself. So what we have here is like the regular tables that we also had previously, but when we look a little bit at blogs and we see this user profile ID, which is a foreign key, we have here now this is nullable, is set to true, which means that whenever we delete a user, the user profile ID for a blog can be set to null. So we just delete the user, but the blog will still be there. And then if we go further to these constraints, we see that for the foreign key, due to the fact that right now our foreign key is nullable, basically we don't have here an on delete or on update, because it can be set to null. So we don't really need to explicitly specify a referential action in this case. And the same, of course, goes for the posts, where the blog ID is nullable, is set to true, and user profile ID once again is nullable and is set to true. So it means that we can delete a blog and the blog ID will be set to null, and we can delete the user, and all the posts from that user will have this user profile ID set to null. And the same goes, of course, for the comments when we compare them with user profile and with the post. So it's exactly the same setup. Now, in the DB context, as we have seen, we just seed the data. That's everything that we do, because we want to have some data in the database. And now we see that the migration and the update is already done, so we can just run the application. But before we run it, I just want to also draw your attention on something that's very similar to actually what we had earlier. So even if we have configured these relationships as being optional, so non-required, the foreign keys can be set to null. Of course, in order for an operation to be performed correctly, all the, well, entities that kind of like are part of that process should be tracked by Entity Framework Core. And that's why when we get the block that we want to delete, we want to include the posts and we want to include the comments because the comments are related to the post. If we don't do this, we will still get an error when we try to delete the block. But if we include all the related entities, even if that is an optional relationship, the application will actually run correctly. So in fact, let me run the application and we will be able to just take a look and see that here in the outcome of the application, we'll see that deleted message. It means that the blog was successfully deleted. So if we wouldn't have added the posts to this blog and then the comments to the post, that wouldn't have been possible. Now, if we go to the database and let's just, do a refresh on these tables because I should have them by now. And if we go, for instance, for the post and let's say select this top 1000 rows, we see that for the first one, the blog ID is now set to null because we have deleted the blog to which this original post belongs to, so it is right now set to null. And that would be the same if you would delete the user ID or a certain user profile, then all the user profile IDs for that profile will be also set to null. However, the only thing, once again, that we should be careful about, even if we have these optional relationships, is that we should just also include all the related entities. Otherwise, this will fail because then basically what Entity Framework Core will try to do, it will try to only update the blog. And of course, SQL will not allow that by default because it doesn't really know what to do with that. But due to the fact that we include the posts and then the comments, Entity Framework will automatically set those specific foreign keys to null. So the insert or the update basic, or actually this is a delete in the database, will be successful. So that's a very, very important thing. Good. I think that this is all for this video. We covered some real ground here, but I guess that right now everybody should be very familiar with what referential actions are, how do they work, what the cycles of cascading paths are, how we can solve the problems, and the very, very common error that we might get when we have required relationships. We have also looked into some possible caveats when we kind of like want to work around that issue. And we have seen that actually the message of the exception is not 100% correct, because if we set the referential action to no action, we will still have an error, but when we actually try to do something or when we try to perform an action on database. We have looked into how we can really set this up in a correct way by using this client set null as a referential action, and by also including all the related entities that are part of that specific process when we want to get the resource that we want to delete or to update for that matter, because they need to also be tracked by Entity Framework Core. And last but not least, we have looked into a different strategy in which we can go about this type of problem. And in the second strategy, the main idea is that we don't really need maybe to delete the data. Like when we delete the user profile, we don't really need to delete all the other stuff. And when we delete a blog, we don't really need to delete the posts and the comments and so on and so forth. And once again, I would like to emphasize that this, is usually defined by the requirements for the application that you are working with, because they might want to use that data, even if theoretically is deleted, they might want to still use the data for other purposes, like for statistical and historical reasons. And in that case, you can just configure those relationships as non-required or as optional by simply making the foreign keys nullable. And that will kind of like allow you to set null values to the foreign keys when you delete a parent entity. And to do this, we have seen that also very important that when you want to perform a delete in this scenario, you also have to include the related entities when you get that resource or get that blog from the database, because those also need to be tracked by the Entity Framework Core DB context so that it sets the value for the affected foreign keys to null. Otherwise, it will still fail. If you did enjoy this content, please hit the subscribe button. If you didn't do this already, of course, hit the thumbs up button to this video. That would be very, very helpful. And if you have any questions, then hit or go over to the comment section and leave a comment, ask a question, and I would be more than happy to get into a discussion with you. And if you think that there might be other people that would benefit from this content, don't be shy and feel free to share it with your colleagues, with your peers on your social media, maybe on different platforms like forums, and wherever you actually see fit and you think that there might be somebody that would find this useful, share it, and I'm sure that that person will be totally thankful to you. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.